Welcome to Women in Cleantech and Sustainability's event, Securing Your Seat on a Corporate Board of Directors. I am Julia Murphy and board member of WCS, co-chair of the Career Development Committee and the Pitch Comp Committee. I want to thank our sponsor today, Canadian Solar, and in particular, Kathy Hellman, who has been a big support at Canadian Solar for WCS as a corporate sponsor. Next slide, please. So today, quickly, agenda. We have arrived, and we're going to talk a little bit about WCS for those of you who are not aware, and then we'll launch into the panel. We'll leave a good amount of time for Q&A for our amazing panelists today, and then we'll have a thank you and a wrap up. Next slide, please. WCS is in a group that has started in the Bay Area. We have expanded mostly in the West Coast, and now with the virtual world, we are in Chicago, New York, and globally. Before the pandemic, we had about one event every month. Now in the virtual world, we have 2 to 3 events programming throughout the month and networking. So a lot of opportunity. As co-chair of career development with my great co-chair, Melanie Lucas-Conwall, we have a mentorship program. We're in our 5th cohort that we have led and in the middle of it right now. So those of you that are interested in being a mentor-mentee for next year, that will come out in the fall. We also do the executive leadership workshops, which this is one of on the corporate board. We also had negotiations last fall, and we have more programming this spring. And then finally, our flagship event, WCS Talks. It's a TED Talk style event. And we have broken it up in the virtual world into 4 events. Normally it's at Google in November, a whole day. Our next one is coming up. Next slide, please. On March 13th, and it's part 3. If you have not bought this series already, you can go onto our website and purchase this event. It is excellent, and you hear from some amazing women. And then March 25th, we have our cities shaping the cities of the future, and that is also a panel event. And then on April 1st, this is our 2nd WCS Speed Mentorship Program, and this is led by Mayura, who is part of our Career Development Committee. So mark the calendar for that. Next slide. New virtual membership is not so new anymore because we've been in the virtual world, but we decided to create a virtual membership at a discount to our normal membership. And I won't go through all these great benefits, but they're on our website. If you have not already and want to sign up, we have a lot of programming as I've described. Next slide, please. And now I'm really excited to introduce Susan Gladwin. And Susan is the lead of this event and the moderator. And it has been a joy to work with her on this, very near and dear to my heart and kind of a thing on my to-do list of what I want to do. And we are also going to be launching a cohort, which you're going to learn more from Susan on that today. And with that, I want to introduce Susan. Susan is a market strategy and product executive with expertise in technology, sustainability, and climate solutions. She worked at Autodesk for over a decade, propelling the company's recognition as a sustainability leader for design and engineering of the built environment, manufacturing, and energy infrastructure. She also created a portfolio of over 3,000 design-led clean tech startups worldwide. Susan also serves on the advisory board of multiple emerging clean climate tech leaders and on the board of California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. She is founding a network to accelerate and cross-sector collaboration on climate mitigation among corporate board directors. With that, I want to turn it over to Susan. Thank you, Susan, so much.
Thank you, Julia. It's been so great to work with you and the team on this. And everyone who's here today, welcome. We're so excited to have you here for what will be, for sure, a lively and informative discussion. We're really fortunate to have a fantastic panel today of leaders who are experts on the imperative of sustainability and who are serving on a wide array of boards. Once we get underway, you may prefer to use speaker view rather than gallery so you can see who is speaking more easily. So this is a super exciting time with a call for more diversity on boards. This is an opportunity for us as sustainability and clean tech leaders to gain seats and influence for ESG programs. That is why we are here. So we have 3 objectives for today. First of all, to demystify the board experience. Second, to inspire you to consider serving on boards, to set that intention, whether private or public, as part of your career journey, and to give you some actions that you can take to start or continue to get on boards. So I'm very pleased to announce today that for those who are interested in going further to learn more about these topics, like Julia said, we're putting together a cohort of senior leaders in WCS or who would like to join us through WCS in partnership with 3 organizations, 2 of whom are represented here today. One is Athena Alliance and one is Competent Boards. These 3 organizations have given us a great discounted offering to go through their incredible board curriculum programs and be part of their platforms. So if you're interested, the call to action for you is put a note in the chat with your email saying specifically that you're interested in the WCS board cohort, and we'll follow up. So in a moment, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists, but first I want to quickly recap the agenda for today. As Julia mentioned, we'll have Q&A. So in about 25 minutes or so, we'll start looking for your questions that you can be submitting in chat as we go. So we'd like to be able to have you ask your question on camera if it's selected. So I'll call you to do that. If for some reason you can't be on camera but have a question, just make a note when you put your question in the chat and we'll read it for you. Just say like off camera or something. And to take advantage of hearing from this wonderful group, we're giving ourselves until 1:30 Pacific to be in conversation today. So with that said, let's get started. It's incredible to think it was almost a year ago to the day that we met in person on this topic in San Francisco at last year's WCS corporate board event. I think it might have been the last in-person event that WCS had. And that was quite an amazing time. And I really felt it was important to sort of pick back up on that topic. And I'm really pleased that one of our panelists from last year, Nancy Floyd, is rejoining us. And for those who are in the audience, who were with us last year, you'll be able to hear what's new for her since we last met. We had another panelist last year, Veena Ramani from Ceres, who had to drop out just because she's actually testifying at the House as we speak about her work with boards and ESG. So nonetheless, we have a report that we'd like to share from you from Veena Ramani's work at Ceres that we'll put a link to in the chat for you about boards and ESG. We've also got another report from another one of our panelists, Helle Bank-Jorgensen from Competent Boards on future boardroom competencies. So we'll post another link there for you. And then we've got a third and final report. This is from Tensi Whalen, who leads the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. It's a very readable short report about the current state of play with ESG in boardrooms. And it really highlights the need for the kind of expertise we as women in clean tech and sustainability can bring to boardrooms. So no need to open those now. I just wanted you to have those for future reference. And now I'm really pleased to introduce our panel. All of our panelists are really recognized in their fields. They have extensive accomplishments as well as lots of speaking and publishing background that we won't have time to get into. So I'll just be giving you the really briefest glimpse of what they're doing today for orientation. And I'll have them say hello back to me as I introduce them so they can pop up in your speaker view as well. Or gallery view, whatever. But anyway, that will pop them up so you can see them more easily. Nancy Floyd, I'll start with you. Hello, Nancy. Thanks for joining us on the panel today.
Hi, Susan. Glad to be here.
Yeah, super glad to have you. Nancy is the founder of Nth Power, the pioneering clean tech venture firm. Formed in 1993, Nth Power has raised $425 million in 4 funds and invested in 56 early stage companies. Nancy's has served on 13 portfolio company boards for Nth Power and chaired 4 of them. She served on the board of directors of WGL Holdings, a gas utility serving Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia for the past 9 years, and was specifically recruited to bring clean energy expertise to the board. And she's got a whole new chapter to share with us, which I'm very excited to hear. Anne Mcdougall is also joining us. Anne, great to have you today.
Hello, great to be here.
Anne is CEO and co-founder of the Donnelly Fund, a family impact investing and charitable organization. She also sits on the boards of Opiant Pharmaceuticals, Inc., a NASDAQ-traded specialty pharmaceutical company, and Atmos XR, a technology and logistics company. She was, until recently, interim chair of Progenics Pharmaceuticals and led the board and successful sale of the company to Landhaus Holdings. So that'll be interesting to hear about. She's co-creator and seed funder of 2 writing fellowships, the Encore Public Voices Fellowship and the Public Voices on the Climate Crisis, which is together with Yale. Coco Brown is here too, and we welcome her. Coco, glad to have you.
Nice to be here.
Coco, I could barely hear you.
Oh, hi, nice to be here.
Great. Okay, Coco is CEO of Athena Alliance, a digital platform for learning and agency for the top women in business striving for C-suite and boardroom. Athena has guided over 400 public and private boards in board design and selection and supported nearly 1,000 women with executive development and community as they rise into the C-suite and boardroom. She serves on the board of Archer Point, from which she is learning about how to run an ESOP-based company. So we might be able to hear about that. And as I mentioned before, Athena Alliance is a partner of the WCS corporate board cohort. So we're really delighted to have their partnership and support for us moving into board ready position as well. And now we get to introduce Hella Bank Jorgensen. Hella, glad to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here, and wow, all this fun in the chat. So many people are coming up here. Excellent. So good to be here.
So Hella is CEO of Competent Boards, which offers a global online ESG, environmental social governance, competent board certificate program with a faculty of over 95 renowned international board members and executives. I personally am going through that. It's an excellent program. Hella is a strategic and operational ESG advisor to boards and investors. She serves on His Royal Highness Prince of Wales Accounting for Sustainability Global Expert Panel, as well as a non-financial digitization working group of the Impact Management Project, Reuters panel of expert judges, and the WBCSD Governance and Internet Oversight High-Level Advisory Group. Competent Boards is also partner of the cohort, again, giving us a special entree into that program and highly recommend it. So, as I mentioned, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the incredible background that our panelists are bringing to the table today. So please read up on them and learn more about what they've done, and you'll get to hear now. And so now we're going to begin our panel. Again, welcome everyone. I hope you're ready for this super great conversation. Start thinking about your questions, and we'll let you put them in a little bit later. I'll cue you when you can start running those in. But to start, Hella, I wanted to start with you. The question that sort of lays the foundation for this, is reflective of our world today, but also your personal work and your decision. You had an incredibly illustrious career to then take all your knowledge and background and focus in on ESG for boards. So I would like you to describe a little bit about why you made that choice to start focusing in on that, why you personally felt that was important, and then why is it important? What is happening in the boardroom that compels us to need to bring people who have sustainability, ESG background and understanding into the boardrooms? Possibly talk a little bit about a couple examples of some companies who are doing this well or not so well too, in terms of how you're seeing this play out. So we'll start there. Thank you.
Wow, that was a few questions. Let me start actually by congratulate both you, Susan, and Julia, women in clean tech and sustainability for all things that you do. I actually think it's people like you that makes things happen. And so when you ask, I guess why is all of this happening now in terms of also what we are doing and what so many others are doing, I think it's because that people like you start doing instead of just talking. And I think if we combine that with the clear signal that we're getting from Mother Nature, that it seems like Mother Nature means business. And if we don't prepare, we will be paying the bills. So I think that what we're seeing right now is that not only consumers are listening, but so are investors and many global leaders, including the board of directors. So let's face it. I mean, if I go a few years back, and I've been on this journey for 30 years, so what I see now is that ESG suddenly gone mainstream. And so has the notion that diversity in the boardroom brings dollars and a broader sense of not only intelligence, but I believe also emotional intelligence. So in my mind, if a board is ready to embrace and value diversity, they do not only think of diversity, but they do also think of equity and inclusion. And that's where I think all of us that I can see now here comes in. Clearly, I mean, let's face it, also 2020 has been a dark year, but it's also been a year where there was a very bright flashlight that I think have shown us the many cracks that we seen in our otherwise very efficient way of doing business. Suddenly all of this efficiency was like, oh, that might be a little bit broken in the supply chain there. Oh, we have frontline workers that are frankly now holding society together on minimum wages. We have mental health issues that we haven't addressed before. And as I said before, add to that, you know, the message that nature sent us with ice storms, that not all are as prepared for as we could hope. So I think that all of this is that companies and societies need to be prepared for future where we will have, I'm afraid, more and more disruptions. Also more disruptions from the one stakeholder, and we talk a lot about stakeholders and shareholders, but the one stakeholder that really doesn't obey by laws, don't respect any borders, but that we do rely on for food, for water, for shelter, frankly, for our livelihood. And I guess most of you will say Mother Nature, right? So I think if nothing else, 2020 has proven that you as a leader need to have emotional intelligence. And we have unfortunately seen here, well, that's last week, that there are leaders out there that tells their employees, stop complaining about the pandemic and you know, this unconscious biases that does not exist. Those leaders today are being fired. You can look it up. I'm not going to, Susan, I know you want to give me to name, but I'm not going to give the name of the company. You can look it up, but they are being asked to, you know, resign or being fired. I think leaders are being held accountable, not just by the employees and consumers, but also by the investors. And that also what we see in the proxy guidelines. And this is also when we come into perhaps, you know, the larger boards, but proxy guidelines from all the large mainstream asset managers. All of them point to the need for boards and management to be competent when it comes to ESG, to sustainability, and to climate. And I think what's important is that it's not just about, oh, let me read from a notebook while I'm talking to others, but actually have the mindset. Have that mindset of understanding the stakeholders, understanding the E in environment, understanding the S in social, and tying it also together and understanding the G in governance. So Susan, you mentioned that we published this survey report on the future boardroom competences. And what we actually did there was that we combined the findings, and I should say we went out and asked over 100 global leaders about what do they see as the competences, as the personal traits that you need to have as a board member in the 21st century. And we took all of this and we combined it into 4 different icons: a heart, a brain, a hand for kind of like action, and a person who has the needed attributes, but think globally. And I believe that we need to, you know, really understand that this is not just having one competences, but not understanding the whole. And I think, you know, looking at a lot of women here, I'm not saying men cannot have it, but I'm saying that maybe there is an emotional intelligence that we really can also bring to bear. I think, Susan, you might already have shared the report, and so feel free to, of course, download it, look at all these qualities, competences, personal traits that other leaders are saying that board members in the 21st century should have. You could use it, and I know some are, as almost like a roadmap for own personal development towards a board seat. So Susan, stop me if it's.
Well, what I'd like to hear, Hella, also is your decision to start competent boards. What about boards? What about I know you came from an illustrious career to PwC and many other experiences. What made you feel like there was a need to do that, and why did you feel like that would be the right solution to put together?
Well, I think like so much else, and I think we all have it. Frankly, I got frustrated. So I have had the chance to work with so many board of directors, so many companies, so many leaders. And I found that when I was out, helping a company and we did all this great stuff, but then the CEO shifted or somebody else shifted and realized, well, it was a pet project. It wasn't embedded in the governance. And so at that point, I was working with Unilever, Paul Pullman and Michael Tresco, who was the chair of Unilever at that point. And I said to Michael Tresco, what are you doing all of these? And very quickly, I figured out, well, many leaders don't have had any education in all of these, and how should they? I mean, when I started my career as an accountant and business lawyer as well, but one of the questions was, how much can you deduct in bribe? And you could deduct bribe, and this is, I'm not that old, right? So, and I think most of us, well, no, I'm looking around you, perhaps not all. Some of us remember when we could smoke in the airplanes. Okay, think about it. We could do that, right? And I think what we don't really understand is that leaders are raising through the ranks of companies, and suddenly they now find themselves at the top of the pyramid, if we can put it like that, as board of directors, but don't have that full understanding. So basically, Susan, what I wanted to do is I wanted to give leaders the insight, the foresight to make informed decisions. And I did that then by going out to all of these. We now have over 100 global leaders that's helping and bringing in their insight. So simply going out and getting their insight, and then I can bring that out to you and so many others. So we learn the language of the board, but also learn, and perhaps one of the things that really makes me happy when I hear that from alumni is that this is giving me the confidence, this is giving me the courage to go and say yes to that board position, to go and actually say yes to have that chair position as responsible for sustainability committee, to go and ask and be a little bit of saying, yes, I need to understand this. So I think that's perhaps one of the big extra things. And I know the network is a global cohort, as you know, and the network is kind of like everyone is then also helping each other. And I know people are helping each other to board positions as well. So it's kind of like it's growing in its impact as well in that way.
Yeah. I love what you said about embedding this in governance, because it's true. You get a committed CEO like Paul Pullman at Unilever, and if he leaves, does it all go away? So I think that is a perfect encapsulation of why board governance is so important when it comes to bringing in the topics that everybody in WCS cares about and is motivated by. So that was very useful, and we can kind of pick up on that theme. Thank you, Hella. Nancy, I want to bring you in. As I mentioned before, you were with us last February in San Francisco, and at that time you were leaving you had left the board WGL Holding that we talked about, and I'm just so excited to share, for you to share. I don't want to give it away, but please share what's happened.
Right. Well, for those of you who weren't there last February, I was recruited in 2011 to the board of WGL Holdings, which is the natural gas utility serving Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And I was recruited, the CFO, who I knew, called me up and asked if I would be interested. And I was recruited specifically because the company wanted to build out a large clean energy portfolio on the unregulated side. So invest roughly $100 million a year to build out a green portfolio. And they didn't have anybody on the board who had that expertise in green technology. And by the way, I was the first board member to not live in the service territory to be on the board. And it was a very old company, founded in 1848. At the time I spoke last year, I'd just gone off the board. I served for 9 years. The company merged with a large diversified energy company in Canada called Alta Gas. And, I want to serve on boards where their mission is aligned with my mission. And as part of the merger, they ended up selling off their clean energy portfolio. So it was time, and I actually announced a year ago that I was starting my search for a new board position, public board position. And we're going to, by the way, talk about stepping stones and how to get to a corporate board. WGL was a New York Stock Exchange listed board, about a $5 billion market cap. There are stepping stones to get there, and we'll cover that during this session. So I'm going to start with the current status. And the current status is that it was just announced last week that I've been appointed to the board of Hannon Armstrong. Hannon Armstrong is a New York Stock Exchange listed company, about $5 billion market cap as well. They were the first public company to invest in finance clean energy and climate projects. And they've grown rather substantially since their IPO in 2013. And in addition, I am being very seriously considered for 2 other New York Stock Exchange listed boards, which the process is later in the year. So let me tell you what I did to actually get on a new public company board. And I sort of tactically did the basics, identified companies that I thought that I would be interested in, and that I thought could utilize my skills. I reworked my bio just to highlight my board experience, because it didn't really read that way. I got on a lot of lists, so things like board prospects, which I think even if you're on a nonprofit board, you can get onto board prospects and you can post your resume. Women corporate directors, of which you had to have been on a public company board to get on. National Association of Corporate Directors, but even updating your LinkedIn profile. I did reach out to recruiters. I did reach out to investment bankers who are often involved in mergers. And I'm going to tell you that, for instance, there's a woman at Deloitte who actually keeps a list of board-ready women for public companies. But the recruiters, in my view, are not the best way to get onto a public company board, because public companies don't always bring on new board members every year. It may be a couple of years before they bring on a new board member. It might be 6 months after they brought on a new board member because you have a board member that passed away, which actually happened at WGL. The absolute best way, and the way that I got on Hannon Armstrong, and I'm being considered for these 2 other boards, is networking. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So for the 2 boards that I'm under consideration for, I actually reached out to a board member. I happen to know them. I reached out to the board member. They didn't have a board opening at the time. It was going to be later in 2021. But by reaching out, I then found out actually that they started calling some references, like the former CEO of WGL Holdings. The CEO of both of these companies have reached out to me, and we've had several conversations. And then with Hannon Armstrong, and I've reached out to other board members, but I'm going to talk about the ones that I'm now in consideration for. In the case of Hannon Armstrong, interestingly, they weren't at the very top of my list. And maybe it was, I was trying to be, COVID hit. I was thinking about, not traveling, I was trying to think more regionally. Actually, Hannon Armstrong reached out to me, and it was in the course of a call that I had. I'm on the President's Council for Ceres, and the CEO of Hannon Armstrong is as well. And we were in this President's Council meeting, and he privately chatted me and said, "Your name has come up. We're looking to expand our board. I want a more diverse board." And I did know one of the board members. He ran a national nonprofit, and I sat on his board for 6 years. Again, a nonprofit coming in, and then took it from there. And the reason I was interesting to them, and by the way, they did not use a recruiter, is because my understanding of the landscape of green solutions, green technologies, and also because I had public board experience. And to him, that was very important, because there is a very big difference from being on a private company board or a nonprofit board and being on a public company board. So, so I'm very, very excited about the opportunity. I do want us to talk about stepping stones, but I just want to connect a dot on the nonprofit piece. On the WGL board, as it turns out, 2 board members knew each other by being on the National Board of Catholic Charities. And in Hannon Armstrong's case, not only was I on the board of this national nonprofit, the American Council on Renewable Energy, whose CEO is now on the Hannon Armstrong board, but 2 other members on the Hannon Armstrong board are on the National Alzheimer's board. So there's, I really feel like starting out, really looking at the nonprofit world, if you haven't had, extensive private company board experience like I did, is a really, really excellent way to get started. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Yeah, that's great, Nancy. Thank you. And I definitely will get into some stepping stones. And I'm going to turn over to you and your journey to be on the boards you have been on. And also a little bit about, I think maybe just knowing about your work with Encore and the kind of communications work you're doing, kind of, why don't we think of ourselves on boards? What does it take to think of ourselves on boards? And, knowing that most of us here are aspiring to where you and the other panelists have gotten to.
Yeah, I sometimes think women think about themselves in more modest terms, not always, and that's one of the reasons perhaps they don't think of themselves on board, or at least as early as certain men do. But my own journey, I spent most of my career as a corporate lawyer. And like Hella, I spent many years at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was general counsel of the US firm and then global deputy general counsel. Then I made a radical career pivot and left PwC, left the big business sector, and became the CEO of an impact investing firm called Acumen. And I knew I brought a lot of big firm skills, but boy, did I learn as much from the people that I joined, who were mostly half my age, as I brought them. And then I went off for a fellowship for a year, and then I was the president of a national nonprofit called Encore.org. And I knew once I left PwC that I wanted to be on corporate boards, and particularly public company boards. I had been on nonprofit boards for quite some time and loved it. But particularly once I left PricewaterhouseCoopers, I really wanted to have a foot in the business world as well. The money is nice, but also I love business, and I love making strategic decisions. And I knew too that I only wanted to join the board of a company whose mission and model resonated with me. And like Nancy, I networked. I also went to the headhunters. I got on the lists, and it took a while. But as it so often does, it came out of the blue from my network, and I was invited to join the board of a public pharmaceutical company focused on addiction and overdose. So if you know the Narcan nasal spray that reverses opioid overdose, that's Opion's product. And I said, when I first interviewed for that position to the CEO, I don't have a pharma background. I have a professional services background. I'm very smart. I know about management. I know about M&A. I know about developing talent. I know about ESG. And I said, but if you want me to join your board, I have to have permission to ask some stupid questions. He said, please do. And I did. And I was the only non-industry or medical person on that board. And I found out that my lens, which was quite different from theirs, was quite valuable, given all of the things we were uplisting from the penny stock exchange to NASDAQ and all kinds of refinancings and so on. It turns out that my legal background, although I don't think of myself as a lawyer, was very, very helpful. I was also on a small private board, and I had, as I said, been on nonprofits and investee boards of acumen funds. So I had a fair amount of board experience. I also advised the board of PwC. So I had been an advisor, I had been management, working closely with the board, and then I was a board member. I think it's a wonderful, I really enjoy my board experience. I have been on another public board, and that was a fascinating activist situation, which I can talk about when we talk about sales, being a board member going through a sale of a company. But I really do enjoy it. And I guess one of the things Susan asked us to think about, what would you have done differently? I probably would have started sooner, because it does take a while to get the word out there and to network. I couldn't do it while I was a partner at PwC, but still I could have started while I was at Acumen. So that's one thing I would do differently. And then the other thing I would say is think about your inventory of skills and experience, right? I mean, obviously focused on sustainability and ESG, which is extremely timely right now, but what else are you good at? What have you done? What kind of projects? Have you been working in people development, team building, regulatory, mergers, whatever it may be, because you never know what a company, even a specific industry that might not be exactly where you feel like your experience is, might need. And if you do get one of those board positions, know what you know and know what you don't know, so that you don't opine where you shouldn't be opining, and ask where you can ask the good questions. So those are two things that in hindsight, I wish I'd known earlier. And then just one other thing I wanted to mention, because we talked about it in advance, which is women and minorities on boards. And everybody's thinking about that. Hele mentioned it. I've been watching this not only for my own professional sake, but just generally, I find this fascinating. And I think the progress of women on boards has been painfully slow in this country. It is accelerating now, and there is also attention to getting minorities and underrepresented folks on the board. But I feel like it's very, very late. And I've had countless conversations several years ago about quotas or D&E requirements, or whatever you want to call them. And I was always given a blank, horrified stare. I wrote an op-ed, which was published in Time magazine 3.5 years ago, after a horrible blunder made by a board member of Uber, who, when it was discussed that another woman should join the board, he said, "Oh, we'll have a lot of talking on the board then." I'm sure you remember that, Coco. That was the lead to my piece. And I was arguing for quotas, or call them what you will, not only for women, but for minorities. And I have to say that second piece was mostly just ignored for a long time until very recently, when we're seeing the California law change, we're seeing the proposed rules at NASDAQ change, which I think is really exciting, if long overdue. So, you know, it feels to me like for the folks in this audience who have an interest in a background in sustainability and ESG, whatever your specific experience may be, number one, which is whose time has come, and who are largely women and plenty of people of color, that this is your time. And I think it's really exciting. And I think that you will, if you pursue your board journey and start early with nonprofit boards and thinking about where you want to go, that you will fill the boardrooms of the future, and you will make the kind of difference and move the needle in ways that have not yet been sufficiently moved.
That's awesome. That's why we're doing this. And I really echo, you know, it's not too early to think about it. It's not unlike, you know, the situation with astronauts. We saw a lot of, you know, white men go to the moon and such. And then little by little, that the space capsules opened up to a broader diversity of people, and if people can see themselves in those positions, it changes minds, changes the world. So that's great to hear. Before we go to Coco, Ruchi, if you could bring up the bio slide just to put everybody's picture up on the screen again for those of you who might have joined a bit after we got started. I just want to make sure you know who our panelists are. Go ahead and bring that up, Ruchi.
Yeah, I'll do that.
And then also we're going to go to questions in about 6-7 minutes or so. So please start teeing up your questions for the panelists and put them in the chat. And as I said before, we'll call on you to ask your question live. If you prefer to have us read, I'll take your question. I can restate your question for you if you're unable to go on live. So just for those who joined a little bit late, just recapping again, our panel is about securing your seat on a corporate board of directors with Ann Mcdougall, Coco Brown, Hella Jorgensen, and Nancy Floyd. So really, really fortunate to have these very senior leaders with us today. Okay, you can take that down now, and I'll go over to Coco. Thanks, Ruchi. Coco, you two have had a very interesting journey onto boards, coming off of your leading of companies as well, and then now moving into what you're doing with Athena to help more people move onto boards. So I'd like to start with your personal journey onto boards specifically, and then you can broaden out from there. And then I think also the other topic I wanted you to touch on as we start in is kind of the landscape of board governance. I attended a webinar you did last week about boards, which was really fantastic, and a lot of detail and depth about the broad scope of opportunities beyond what we might traditionally think about when we're thinking about boards. So I'd love for you to touch on that as well.
Absolutely. It's hard to come on the heels of such incredible talent and all of this great work in sort of public companies and large companies and wonderful women that we're surrounded with here. I think maybe my story is a little bit different in that I've only ever worked in private companies. I've worked in smaller companies, but companies I created from scratch. I've been in the Silicon Valley for 28 years now, my entire career. And I was first given my first executive role as vice president back when I was 28 years old, over 20 years ago now. And for me, every rung I climbed on the ladder was one I didn't deserve by sort of conventional measures. I was really not ready for, but I asked for it, grabbed it, took it, kept going. And it was kind of a little bit later in my career that I sort of ended up questioning myself and dealing with my imposter syndrome. I was sort of lucky that I didn't think about it when I was young and ambitious. But, my path to the boardroom really started with the board of my last company, where I was in the role of president and COO. I was the only report to the CEO. I grew the company to 54 million in revenue. And because of my role and because of my ownership position, I was naturally on the board. The same holds true for Athena, in building it. So I'm on the board of it. I am also an independent director on the board of a company called Archer Point, which is an ESOP. And, I didn't even know that ESOPs existed until a few years ago. But the idea is essentially, you see it with like the construction industry or professional services industry. There might have been one or a few people who started the company to begin with, and they decide that their exit strategy really should be to sell the company to the employees, to create a multi-generational company instead of a one generation company. It's a really interesting idea. So a trustee steps in and is involved. And what happens with that then is that the trustee oftentimes requires independence on the board to kind of look out for the interest of the employees, the shareholders, if you will, as well as stakeholders. So that's how I ended up on the board, or that's what Archer Point is it's an ESOP. How I joined that board, my other two boards and all of my nonprofit boards were a little bit more happenstance or just because of the nature of my own role. But this one was, I joined really with a strategy and intentionality. I had to think very hard about what my safeties, my matches, and my reaches are. And I have a whole talk and kind of approach to that. But essentially, if you've ever helped to get into school or have yourself get into a degree program, a college, a university, you've had to think through which schools should they apply to. And that basically boils down to safeties, matches, and reaches. Safeties being the ones that, because you got to get in somewhere, matches being the match you think you can hit, and reaches being the big, hairy, audacious goal that would just be so phenomenal, but a long shot. So I had to think about that for myself and build my strategy around my matches. And for me, a family-owned, private equity-owned, or ESOP-based company made a lot of sense given my own background, which was always scrappy. If you wanted to build something, it had to come from profit. It couldn't come from venture capital just saying, hey, forget about profit, just go grab market share. So I had to think about the sort of ethos, the philosophy, the driving governing structures of different businesses and how they mapped to the kind of businesses I'd been a part of. And it goes beyond that. It's, the kind of four main factors that are like your equivalent of a GPA or SAT score is scale, business model, industry, and governing model. Is it a public company, private company, et cetera? So if you look at those four, you can kind of narrow the ecosystem that way to begin with, and then kind of go from there. That's when skill comes in. Your skills and your attributes and things like that are a little bit more pliable if you fit in more of that first realm. So your safeties, for example, would be the boards where you've been there, done that. The company is at a scale or generally smaller than the scale you've driven and grown. And that can even be public companies. So we're working with a public company right now that has 5 million in revenue, but it's a public company, but we don't tend to think of public companies that way. It's a microcap. You also have biotech companies that have 11 people and are public companies, so it's not just public companies are this, private companies are that. You kind of have to think holistically about the landscape. And it really is, it is kind of four big landscapes for independent directors. One is public companies, of which there are 6,000 on New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. It's ESOPs, of which there are 6,000. It's venture-backed companies, of which there are about 10,000. There's private equity-backed, which is about 8,000. So there's about 30,000 companies out there. But most of what you hear on the, I think I agree with my peers here, it's not about recruiters. It's not about sort of a traditional recruiting model, but a lot of what you hear in that recruiting guidance is focused on the Russell 3000, which is about 10% of the entire landscape. So I would just say don't be discouraged when you look at other women and you say, well, that's just not me. That doesn't mean there isn't a board seat for you, right? It just means that it may be at a different scale company or a different kind of background and model. In terms of what I wish I'd known, I think you wanted me to hit that. I mean, what I wish I'd known for sure was that landscape. I had no idea that this big landscape existed. And I really didn't even think about my approach, my strategy until I was helping my son go to college. And then light bulb hit. And those are some of the things I wish I'd known. But the other thing, the really important thing is exactly, Susan, you just mentioned astronauts. And I thought that's so funny because I think about this way. You know, we wouldn't take a biologist and throw them into space and say, good luck, go do your work up there. We have to teach them to experience zero gravity and do their work with their suit on and things like that. And it is an entirely different atmosphere to be not just in the boardroom, but the C-suite. That atmosphere of the C-suite, the CEO, the boardroom, they're a collective. They operate independently, they're interdependent. It's a really wild ecosystem there that people don't really understand. And we don't spend enough time teaching the hard skills of running a business. So what I wish all these school of hard knocks, what is bankruptcy and how do you stay out of it? I learned that when I had to do it. But, we need to know, how do you read a cap table? Because most women who will join boards will be independent directors surrounded by funders and founders. And they know how to read cap tables, and they know how money is raised, and they know how businesses are started. So really understanding all the hard skills of how to build and run a company in that domain of governance, founding, and funding is something, we spend a lot of time on at Athena, and I wish I'd known more about. And I just wanted to say one last thing about the changing landscape. Just one thought exercise. You all are the experts on clean tech, sustainability, environment. The thing that I think is really super cool is if you look back to 2003, there really wasn't the requirement on public boards for financial expertise until Sarbanes-Oxley hit. And so the interesting question for us is, are there going to be requirements for digital expertise, sustainability expertise, crisis expertise, as boardrooms get more complex? And as those crises are, the crises that have to be solved from the boardroom, I think it's an interesting position we could hold.
Great, thank you. Thanks all of you. And before we switch into starting more of the dynamic conversation and Q&A a little bit, I want to first also remind those who are on with us, if you didn't hear in the beginning, and I'll mention this again at the end, we are putting together a cohort of women like yourselves who would like to go through some board readiness curriculum with Athena Alliance, which Coco runs, with Competent Boards, which Hella runs, also with How Women Lead, who's not represented here. But that's an opportunity for you to come together with us in community to do that. And if you're interested, please put your name in the email in the chat and note you're interested in WCS board cohort, and we'll follow up with you on the details for that. So on that topic, actually, and panel, I invite you to now sort of play off of each other. Feel free to just jump in, and I'll try to see if you're raising a hand, but we can take it as it comes. Getting a lot of questions related to the stepping stones topic. So that's what I'd like to switch over to. We've got Deborah Nucky asking a question off camera. Curious about those of us with smaller company backgrounds, how we should approach this, being on a startups board, having nonprofit board experience already, but no senior roles in larger companies. A similar question from Talia Arbit, and I'm just gonna, because these are linked together, I'm gonna just put them together for you. The panelists are fantastic, and they have extensive professional experience. What would you suggest for women who are earlier in the career and want to move into corporate board space? So that's a little bit different angle. There's people who are a little bit earlier trying to stepping stone their way in. There's people who are maybe further along, but just don't have the same pattern of experience that you've had. So anybody on the panel would like to take that. And if you haven't talked about what you wish you knew, this is also an opportunity to touch on that topic again as well.
Well, Susan, I'll start. And actually, I'll start with something I wish I knew. I wish I had started earlier as well. I think often we lack the confidence as women to think that we're board ready. But let's talk about, people who are earlier in their career. So I went on, I went on the WGL board in 2011. That's 10 years ago. I was in my mid 50s. I think let's talk about the stepping stones. I do think that serving on and finding a nonprofit organization, whether it's regional or not, is a great way to start. It is there are all types of nonprofits. One of my friends who's on this call was actually on the advisory board, whether it's a board or advisory board, to a new science center in Livermore, California, and start there. Get your feet wet, learn what it means to be kind of in a boardroom. What happens in a board meeting, and then. If you can find that private company board experience, I think that's sort of maybe the next stepping stone. But I think you can go from nonprofit to potentially corporate board, depending on your background. And ESG is front and center right now, and is going to be. So, and I know somebody in the chat room asked whether you should lead with that or not. I do think that saying that you have a very strong ESG credential is a great lead in to being considered for any kind of board position. I, of course, was lucky because having started my venture capital firm, I ended up being on 13 private company boards, but I also went on 6 nonprofit boards and learned a lot through that. So I can't underestimate getting that, whether you start with a regional chapter of a national nonprofit and kind of move your way up, that is, in my mind, the place to start. And wherever you are in your career, you can do that.
I could add to that. I think another thing that to think about with your competencies in a space that is front and center is to consider where the investments are going in that space, and whether or not you have the ability to potentially align yourself with different venture firms, private equity firms, as an advisor, as just an ear, as someone they can call and talk to, just get to know them, because they have entire portfolios, as and Nancy's pointing out. How did she get on 13 boards? Well, she had an entire portfolio, right? So there's one company and there's portfolios of companies. So think about those investors that are out there in your space doing things that would benefit from your particular expertise. And I think also, and you can do that at really almost at any point in your career. If you've got an expertise to share, you can share it, and then they get to know you and they appreciate your value. I think, as the other thing that I've seen is boards also value diversity of experience across companies. So if you get the chance to take an international stint somewhere, or you get the chance to move outside of this department into that department, it's great to kind of get a bigger purview over the business. And then also to think about scale, just because we have women in big companies without executive titles joining boards of small companies, and then we have women with big titles in smaller companies joining, so it's really about scale. It's where do you fit in terms of the kinds of scale you've driven and seen that can be helpful to what that company is trying to get to. And then the last thing I'd say is exactly what the other women have said, which is it's never too early to start, because all that's going to do for you is reinforce that you're ready sooner than you think.
Right.
Glenna Weissman, I would like to bring you on to ask your question if you're available.
I am. Welcome, welcome. I am on the board of Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. And my question really relates to what kind of vision, if you're on a board, if you enter into a board and you're particularly representing that sustainability vision, what should we expect of the impact that you can make? What would success look like if I'm on a board and I'm, an ESG expert and I'm wanting to make an impact? Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just say I think it depends on the sector, obviously, and I'm on the board, or have been on the board of 2 public pharma companies. So you're thinking first about manufacturing, and even if the company is contracting out its manufacturing, it is working with contract manufacturers. So there are environmental footprint issues and employee issues and so on. And then also pricing. of the drug. And so I think those are just two examples, but as a board member, and as those issues come up, it is, I think, incumbent upon you to make sure that they're part of the conversation and the discourse. In the case of my company, Opiant, pricing in particular for something that is tackling the opioid epidemic is front and center. And I'm proud of the way we've handled it. And I think it's come from the CEO, but it's also he's been supported by the board on that. But back to how does it happen in the boardroom? I think it really depends on what industry the company is in.
Yes. Go ahead, Helen.
Okay. No, I was just, I mean, I think it's also a part of the due diligence. And I know everyone say, oh, how can I get on the board? I mean, sorry, this is the accountant and the lawyer in me. Do your due diligence, please, right? Because when you get on the board, you actually have fiduciary duty. This is not just sit there and say, wow, I'm on the board. This is a job. This is something where you are providing real value to that company. I'm from time to time asked, like, what should I do if that board member sits in sleep? And I'm like, well, what would you do if the CFO sits in sleep, right? You will react on that. So this is something you prepare really well, and you come there. And I think, one thing is to do due diligence and ask there, so if I am to bring ESG expertise, I'm not only there to kind of like only bring that expertise. In my mind, you need to kind of like have this T where you have a lot of broad expertise, and then you bring something where you have a little bit more expert knowledge. But if you're just there alone, and that's might be the one that, I mean, I started my first board position, I guess, when I was 28, not in the public, because PwC, you're not allowed to do that. But I think it is that if you're there all by yourself and you just sit there and look at everyone else and think like, you want to make sure that you have that relationship with the others around the boardroom table. This is not, in my mind, a place where you go in and say, I'm going to revolutionize everything, right? I mean, then you're probably in the wrong spot. You need to be proud of the company, want to be on the journey with that company, really move it along. So sorry,
I couldn't agree more. I was brought on because of sort of my ESG credentials, I guess you would say, or my expertise. It was an energy company, a gas utility, and they were looking to build out their clean energy portfolio. And I will say, in that case, the board did look to me as we discussed some of the investments that we were making in clean energy. But it went far beyond that. I mean, when you go on a board of directors, you are not a single issue director. Right. You have to understand the business. I actually pushed, when I went on the board of WGL, I was the second woman to go on the board. By the time I left, out of 9 people, we had 4 women on the board, 2 African Americans. The conversation in the boardroom changed dramatically, very much more thoughtful in a way, not so clubby. But in a board meeting, you're dealing with, first the dynamics of the board. And when you first get into a board meeting, you really need to kind of assess that and really observe. And how do they resolve conflicts if there are conflicts, and what's the relationship between the board and the management team? And then you're dealing with regular, sort of your board meetings issues like, operations of the company, finances. In the case of a utility, safety. There are environmental issues, of course, associated with all energy companies. But then you have issues, and I'm going to say things that are publicly known, like that will stretch you, like having a hostile foreign nation take control of your SCADA system, which controls the pressure and the amount of gas that goes into pipelines when you're serving the White House and the Capitol building. Or you have a senior officer that has violated their code of ethics, and you have to figure out what to do about that. Or you get a whistleblower complaint, or you get a gas explosion, you have to deal with the NTSB. you know, because there was a fatality involved. I mean, so these are things that are going to stretch you. You have to be able to, you know, have to be able to help be a board member that helps management and helps the rest of the board deal with these kinds of issues, both the operations of the company, and you don't, on a public company board, by the way, you don't get so granular into operations. You might have one meeting a year where it's a strategy, you go into strategy, and it might be a day and a half instead of a day board meeting. In a private company board, you definitely get much more into strategy. You get much more granular. There's a big difference between the two. But again, back to the ESG, yes, I think boards will, you know, if you get one ESG competent board member, then the board will ultimately come along and learn more about that. But you can't be a single issue board member.
I'd like to bring in Sam Miyamoto if you're on the line.
Sure. Yeah. So it's Sam Miyamoto. Thank you so much. So my question for the panelists, I think that I mean, I'm not experienced in this at all, but my question comes from, like, in a world where, like, climate change requires a lot of social activism in order to move the needle towards something that is remotely livable going forward. And there have been clashes between, you know, corporate and social. And I'm wondering how serving on a corporate board would impact that work, or if it does or if it doesn't, what the relationship with that space is like. So,
you know, one thing, if you haven't read it or aren't following what the World Economic Forum is saying on this front, or what Larry Fink is saying on this front, I would highly recommend you do. Larry Fink writes a letter to CEOs every year, and the last 2 years he's talking about climate. And Larry Fink is the CEO of the largest asset management firm in the world, $8 trillion of assets under management, which means he's got a lot of control over the market. And what he controls is really being able to vote against board members. And he's not the only one. It's just that he's a pretty prominent one. But I do think there's this, I think Nancy mentioned it earlier, there's this big struggle between stakeholder and shareholder, and there's an increasing sort of movement towards the stakeholders' interest for long-term sustainability, long-term viability of everything, of the community in which you are in, of the employees that you serve, of your supply chain, of everything, of our Mother Nature. And the stakeholders winning out over, it's a tough battle, but they seem to be winning out over this issue of short-term returns, you know, quarter over quarter analysts reporting and guidance and short-term focus. And that's the big rub right now that's going on. But I think we're on the right side of history, and the time is really, you know, for you, which is fantastic. You're in the right place.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I would add one thing, which is I think that I agree completely, and I said it myself, that this is the time is coming, ESG is top of mind and all that. But that doesn't mean when you walk into a particular boardroom that everybody is sold on the idea. And that's why I really second Nancy's point of reading the board. There may need to be an education process. There may to be a gradual process of awakening other members of the board who might be skeptical about all this climate change stuff or the long-term sustainability stuff, and bringing them along. And it's an interesting, when you're actually looking for boards who are not specifically seeking people with ESG or sustainability skills, some of the more conservative boards will say, you know, we don't want a social justice warrior or a climate activist. So you've got to get in there with the skills. I think they should be part of your array of what you bring to the table, but you can't expect receptivity to activism in every board right away. It's got to be, you know, what's right for the business, what's the fit, and how does sustainability make sense for the long term for the shareholders and other stakeholders. So it really depends on the board.
And maybe if I can add to that, and it goes back to Coco, what you were saying in terms of the amount of ESG competent board members. So there was a survey done that I commented on last year, but we looked at the largest companies. It was the largest companies, but those are also the ones that the Larry Finks of the world, so the BlackRocks of the world, are going out saying you need to be ESG or sustainability, have the competences. So this organization looked at the largest companies and saw, okay, how many directors were serving on committees that were overseeing sustainability and ESG. Not just the board, on the committee, especially to serve. All going up, all being more directors serving there, more sustainability committees, etc. But when I then looked at the data, it turned out that there was 17%, 17% of the directors that served on a committee overseeing sustainability that actually had any kind of where you could see, oh, they actually have ESG or sustainability competences. There's a lot of the boards that had the committees, but actually didn't have any directors serving on it. So I mean, I went out and said, hey, would we be happy if we had 17% of directors serving on audit committees that were able to read the P&L or income statement and balance sheet? And I think most of would go like, no, we wouldn't be happy if only 17% actually had the literacy. So I think we will be seeing more and more of that demand. But I'm just saying that because it might be that there are boards out there and board members out there like, well, I serve on the committee, so therefore by definition we already have that covered, but that might not be fully the truth. So just putting it in there.
Yeah, I guess the way to start, in my view, as somebody who has an ESG credential going on a board, is really getting the company first to look at the risks to the company and its business associated with ESG issues. And again, I had a different experience because the company that I joined, WGL Holdings, was looking to build out, clean energy portfolio. So, but in a broader sense, that's where I tried to steer the board, was also going beyond just that clean energy portfolio and looking at what were the risks near term, midterm, and long term to the business on all three levels, E, S, and G. So and I will say, somebody used the word activism. Sam, I think you used the word activism, or somebody did. Activism on a board, I mean, in the sense of going in and and pounding on the table, on a single issue is just not going to make you an effective board member. Or two, are you fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility, which is you're watching out for the company for all of its shareholders. So I would be a little careful in using the word activism in conjunction with a board seat, and that's just me. I know there are activist shareholders, and I know Anne's has had experience with this, but I think there are more, what I'll say, constructive ways to introduce the ESG subject.
I wanted to just ask you all just to talk a little bit more about what is fiduciary, exercising your fiduciary responsibility look like? Like just an example, and you can anonymize it as needed, but an example where you were in a boardroom and you had to do that. There was a conversation that had to be had or a topic that had to be addressed. And I know, Nancy, you mentioned a few, like, if a gas pipeline exploded and so forth. What is the real role of a board in exercising that responsibility? Can you speak to that, just to give it a little more, make it a little more concrete, any of you? But yeah, Nancy.
I will say what as a board member, because you're not obviously interfacing with the NTSB on a gas explosion, is making sure that the management team is taking all the right steps. In the case of that, it is making sure that we are being extremely transparent and supportive. NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board, that were very transparent and supportive of the investigators. I can tell you there have been other utilities where there have been, many incidences that have not been transparent and have tried to actually hide evidence. So I think you want to make sure that management is doing the right thing in a situation like that, and that probably applies to every example that I gave is management taking the right steps.
Hella.
Go ahead, Hal.
I think we are seeing a change at the moment. I think we are seeing stewardship from being that we as board of directors are overseeing, which I think, and there's very much, but the stewardship at the board, if the board have not asked the right questions, we are starting to see that can then lead to lawsuits, etc. It's different from country to country, but we will, I think, be seeing very soon that more kind of like lawsuits, and we can already see it on the insurance premiums, on the director and officer insurance prices going up, and clearly also now during the pandemic, there's a lot of things where suddenly it's like, oh, the board should have ABC. So just back to my thing about due diligence, please ask the questions before you just say, yes, I would like to do this. So I think it's we will see that. What does good governance look like? It's changing. We're actually having the next session we are having is about the future of good corporate governance. Mervyn King, who is the world's renowned in terms of governance, but also the chair of RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, discussing what does it look like. And I can just see it for each year. It's more and more the role of the board and the responsibility of the board are kind of like increasing. Nancy?
Yeah. I would say, it's interesting because like the legal definition, of course, is the duty of loyalty plus the duty of care. I don't find that particularly helpful when you're in the crucible of a difficult situation. It's good to know. And for me, it's thinking about all of the stakeholders. So recently I went into this because of this slate of activists was successful, and the issue was pure business. It wasn't to do with climate change or anything like that. It was pure business, and the company was being mismanaged. And we went in with a majority of the board, and the company had committed itself to be sold, even while this proxy battle was going on, which was wrong. But we really had to think about what hat to wear the whole 7 months that we were in there, because it was our job to go in and take an independent look on what was right for the shareholders, the companies, the patients served by the company, the employees to some extent, and other stakeholder considerations. And it was what was incredible. And we just kept having to think about that. And when we went in, we thought that we were going to kill the sale and take the company standalone. And we found out that actually that wasn't the right answer. We should sell the company, but we needed to negotiate a better deal. So the whole time you're thinking about, what's best under the circumstances, and remembering your responsibilities and remembering our duty to think independently. And we had to work with two of the directors that were holdovers from the kind of the prior administration, but we all put our independent hats on. And it was a real kind of daily exercise in being reminded of who we served. And it wasn't just the shareholders, although we did well by the shareholders. It was the patients and the continuity of these clinical trials and so on. So, it's so interesting that when you're in the breach, that's what teaches you about your duty as an independent director, I think, more than lofty legal precepts.
Yeah. We're supposed to start wrapping. I'm supposed to start wrapping, but there's a couple more questions I want to quickly squeeze in. Michelle Santangelo, are you on the line? Would you be able to ask your question? Michelle?
Hi, yes, I'm on the line.
Go ahead.
Thank you. My question was regarding if our background is more on the applied side of the ESG, sustainability, energy, renewables, and not so much on the financial end, would it be beneficial to focus a little bit more on the financial end, take some performa classes or other certification of that nature?
This is kind of to my point earlier that, I think we spend a lot of time talking about soft skills, soft skills, hard skills. It's not a one is better than the other. It's just, we spend a lot of time on sort of negotiation and gravitas and leadership and how to get to the boardroom and things like that. But I think we do need to spend more time learning about what goes on in that space. And it's more than just the financials. It's how does the budget happen? How does a CEO's performance review get done well? What happens when you've set the compensation plan and then COVID hits? What's the board's involvement with the officers in terms of onboarding and offboarding and firing? There's so many things to know. And I think it behooves us to spend time asking those questions. What is a SPAC and how does it operate? And do I need to care? So much M&A activity happens with, oversight from the boardroom. How does M&A activity work? Just diving in and understanding all that stuff, I think it's great for your career in general, whether you're going to be a C-suite executive or a CEO or a board member. You should get curious. You should lean into all aspects of the business because you want to be in a space where you are a steward over the whole. You're not going to be one-dimensional, as all my peers all just pointed out. Yeah, I agree. Totally into that.
Anyone else, or I'll go on to another question.
No.
Hella?
Well, I think this is all right what you're saying there. I mean, if I think back, and I have a lot of young people that comes to me and say, oh, how can I get into sustainability and how can I work with sustainability? And often I say, if that is your passion, why don't you then go into another function and learn that? So I started as an accountant, right? So I know how to do the audit. I've been out counting all the different things, the budgets and all of that. And by doing that, I think I have that much broader view on all of these things and can understand when I say, we need to embed ESG, environment, social governance, into everything we do. I speak and I understand the language of the CFO, all of these different, and the board. And if you don't do that, and I'm originally from Denmark, if you haven't heard the accent, but what I say from time to time is that if you don't understand Danish, even if I shouted as loud as I could, you still don't understand it. You need to understand the language of the people you want to communicate with. And that's where I think, yes, you need to understand, the P&L, the income statement, the finance, the budget, and all of those things. You don't need to be an expert. But you do need to kind of just look at your own finance and, hey, see if you can figure that out first. So
that's great. So the very last thing, and we'll make it very quick responses, just some nuts and bolts. There's a question came in about compensation. I know when we met last year, we did get to hear, on the one hand, you've got tremendous responsibility. You've got these 300-page board packets that you have to review and you get them the night before, et cetera, but you are compensated, at least at this level. Maybe you could talk briefly about the compensation kind of at the tiers of the different kind of biggest type of company boards down to the smallest, and what one could expect or should be asking for, or be, just knowing that that's part of the package and serving on these boards. Nancy, I saw you went off.
Yeah, so the compensation, the reason a lot of people want to go on corporate boards is that the compensation is very significant. And most boards, it's split between cash and stock. And so, I'd say a middle of the road board will pay you $100,000 in cash and $100,000 in stock. And so the cash pays the taxes on the stock. And, and having stock is important. Having ownership in the company is important. And if the stock, appreciates, that's great. And, you have some role in that. Some boards pay a lot more. One of the boards I'm being considered for pays $300,000, half in cash, half in stock. And you get paid extra for being chair of audit or chair of governance. or chair of compensation committees. So it's very significant pay, but don't underestimate how much work it really is. So I say I'm being considered with two other boards. I will only go on one if I'm lucky. I know that the organization, National Association of Corporate Directors, I think recommends no more than 4, but if you're on 4 public company boards, you better have a full-time assistant. I mean, it is really a lot of work. So it sounds like a lot of compensation. And I will say, you know, it does feel like a lot of compensation at times, but it is a lot of work. And if you get into a situation like a merger or some crisis, you're on the phone every single day. So that's just my experience.
Any last comment, or we can end there? Coco?
Well, I'll just, on private company boards, and Nancy, and I think we could all talk to this, but private company boards, you're most likely to only get equity and until it's much late, until they're really planning for an exit that they think is going to be an IPO, then you might get cash and equity. And the bigger the company, the sort of the greater the value, the thinner your slice of the pie. But then, roughly equivalent, I generally see that you can sort of translate it to cash value based on the current value of the stock and how much they're giving you over a vesting period, and then you can kind of translate that down to like, what is that worth for my time? So it might be 60K, it might be 100K of stock value, but the younger the company, the higher the risk, the more likely that that's never going to be anything. And so
Right.
you use it as a stepping stone. Somebody was saying, it's great experience. You have to be passionate about it. You definitely don't want to go into it just because it's a stepping stone, but it may not be what you're looking for if you're ultimately trying to build your next career portfolio where you can make money from this. You're going to have to see something through to an exit to do that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, but this is not just about money. I mean, really, being on these boards is just so intellectually stimulating. I mean, it really is. And I don't care if it's a nonprofit, a private company board, or a public company board. I'm not doing it for the compensation. It's just so stimulating.
Super. And that's a super way to end. I remember we talked about that last year as well. And that also inspired me to kind of keep trucking along to try to get myself and more of us all on these paths, because I think the interest and the impact is really compelling. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie in just a second. Let's just give our fantastic panelists a virtual round of applause. I'm sure if we were in a room together, we would have a thunderous amount of applause and appreciation. I also want to thank our volunteers and the team who made this possible. And please stay on the line for important wrap-up comments from Julia. And we'll again thank our wonderful panelists for this fantastic event. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you. That was amazing. And we're just so honored to have you all doing the panel today and how much we learned. And I know we didn't get to all the questions. We had some amazing questions that I was noting throughout and we'll have more time to talk about that as networking and so forth. But I want to thank everyone today and the volunteers, Ruchi, of course, Susan for leading the event and moderating, Kelly and Sempna for helping, and as Johanna as well. And this is a QR code. You can, for volunteers, you can go to the next slide. And this is a survey too. They get 25% off at all WCS Talks events. We usually do the surveys at the WCS Talks event as well. It's a pretty quick survey to do, so please check it out. And then next slide. And just join us in the virtual world. I think some of you already know that we are very active on social media, and we will be posting more and more things and more events coming up. For the Executive Leadership Series, we're going to be doing a communications workshop, which really talks about the levels of communication with Pam Baker, and she did one last year and it's phenomenal. And so look forward to that, as well as the other events that we talked about. But again, thank you all. I'm just so joyed, and it was great to see the interest in the cohort. You'll hear more about that. Susan and Ruchi and Julie and I will be working on that going forward and working with Coco and Hella. So thank you all. Have a great day.